Today, we'll be talking about Witchblade. Many of you may not even remember what Witchblade is or does because you hardly pick it up these days, so a little refresher on the stats here. Witchblade currently provides you with 45 physical protection, 15% attack speed, and has an aura that gives enemies within 55 units 20% attack speed reduction, and the physical power is also reduced by 30. So this item in general is supposed to counter auto attack, basic attack based characters, mainly hunters and some others where it kinda works decently. The item also has a relatively low price tag with 2050 gold to its name, which is fairly decent, and the stats are not necessarily that bad for such an item. So why don't we see it? The main problem with Witchblade is that it's just not the best item for any slot ever. Early on, it's not that great because it doesn't provide you with health and the protection is not that high. Later in the game, you're not gonna buy that many cheap items that don't really have a major purpose for you. So all in all, it doesn't really have a place where you would buy it, even though it's kinda cheap and has some nice stats. There's no reason to buy it over Midgardian Mail at this point. That wasn't always the case though. There used to be a time, especially around Season 1, when Witchblade was really strong and it was very frequently picked up, especially on solo lanes, but sometimes on supports as well, and it was a great item overall. What was different back then? The item was 150 gold more expensive, the attack speed reduction was only 15%, and the physical power reduction was only 25%. So those stats were actually worse and the item was more expensive. However, in addition to the stats the item has now, it had 15% movement speed, which basically made it a core pickup on pretty much any warrior that could make some use of it. Because of that, Hi-Rez decided that the item was too strong and nerfed it by completely removing the movement speed. That makes sense at that point. It was too strong, it was overused, it was a top tier item so to speak, and it needed some nerfs. But after that, there was really not much of a point in picking up Witchblade anymore. It fell off so hard that it basically disappeared within a few months at least, and it didn't show up since then. Even to this day, some of the casters frequently wonder why supports don't pick up this item anymore, but when you think about it, there's really no reason to pick it over Midgardian Mail. So it's just dead. It's a completely dead item for now. And if you look at the stats back then and compare them to newer items, it doesn't really sound so terrible. Once again, the old version had 45 physical protection, 15% attack speed, 15% movement speed, and the aura for 2200 gold. Let's look at another item. This item has 200 health, 10% cooldown reduction, 20% attack speed, so an additional 5%, 10% movement speed, so only 5% less here, and a passive that allows you to get an increased relic duration. Yep, I'm talking about Ritual Dagger, which only costs 2000 gold. Even Witchblade's version nowadays is more expensive. I really don't see much of a reason to ever pick Witchblade over Ritual Dagger. I know they have different purposes, as in one of them counters ADCs better than the other, but overall, the stats on Ritual Dagger are so bloated in comparison to the new Witchblade, which has two different stats and an aura, that there's really not much of a reason to ever use this item. I think that with all the new movement speed items we got, especially with the tree that includes all the daggers like Masamune and so on, and Stone Cutting Sword, there would not be much of a problem in putting at least some movement speed back on Witchblade. It doesn't have to be 15%, it doesn't have to be nearly the same as boots, but it could be a solid 10% and the item would be fine, or maybe even just 7%. Something like that would really help this item, give it more flexibility, viability, and bring it back into the meta where it has not been for ages. So the reason why I'm making this video is because I have a plea for you guys. You know how there's a feedback form after every patch, or before every patch, where they ask you which things you want to see changed? Well, there's this tiny little question at the bottom: which item do you think needs a buff? And I am of the opinion that Witchblade does really need a buff to bring it back to viability. And I think it would be really cool if some of you guys would just, mark that down and let Hi-Rez know what you think about the item and why it should be buffed, or if it should be buffed. Maybe you're completely against my opinion because you hated the Witchblade meta, but overall, I think this item could be a great counter item, and I really, really love counter items that counter specific guards or specific scenarios and works in some way. And back then it was a part of the reason why ADCs weren't OP, even though they had ridiculously strong items, much stronger than these days, with better stats. But thanks to Witchblade, they were kind of kept down a little bit. And while this item being buffed may lead to hunters needing some buffs in return, I still think it should have a place in the meta. With that, thank you guys for watching. Duke Sloth, out.